When the authorities pulled off the takedown of the century, they brought the American mafia to its knees, but missed the biggest prize of all.
Vincent Chin Gigante was unquestionably the most powerful, most intriguing, and wealthiest mob boss of the late 20th century.
He was the capo di tutti capi, the one they all had to answer to.
For decades, Gigante carries out the most stunning act of deception in the history of the mafia. Faking mental disability, he quietly becomes one of the most powerful mob bosses of all time.
Vincent Gigante was dubbed in the tabloid press as the Odd Father. He would slip into character to create a persona for the world to see that he was a doddering old man and not a murderous mob boss.
But when the FBI realize their mistake, they use all their resources to expose him. But will the master magician get away one last time? By the mid-1980s, 5 mafia families run the city of New York. Through their control over construction, transportation, and the labor unions, they use extortion and violence to dominate the city's economy. For years, the authorities have battled against them with limited success. But now, the US government prepared to deliver what they hope will be a death blow. The plan is bold, but simple. To cut off the head of the mafia snake by taking direct aim at the men who rule New York. Men like the Colombo family boss, Carmine Persico. Head of the Gambino crime family, Paul Castellano. Lucchese godfather, Antonio Dux Carallo. And Fat Tony Salerno, leader of the powerful Genovese family. Together they form the governing body for the entire US Mafia, known as the Commission. The task of sending these men down falls to attorney Rudolph Giuliani, the man who would one day become mayor of New York City. Giuliani believes that taking out the bosses will effectively destroy organized crime in the city.
Giuliani indicted the heads of all 5 New York City crime families, which was, completely unprecedented and unheard of.
Giuliani and his team order the 5 mafia bosses to be brought in. It's the boldest move ever taken against the US Mafia.
Once and for all, the government was saying that in New York City, organized crime exists, and these are the leaders of the 5 organized crime families. So the prosecution was significant and garnered a lot of publicity and press at the time.
As they prepare for their courtroom showdown with the mob, the government knows that the stakes couldn't be higher.
Until then, virtually most mob bosses were immune from prosecution. The higher-ups didn't do any real acts. They didn't pull a trigger. They didn't stab anybody. They didn't shake anybody down.
Giuliani's challenge now is to make sure he secures his convictions. He has a powerful weapon on his side. The 1972 Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO. RICO is key legislation designed to catch the big fish that until now have always managed to wriggle free.
But the key to the RICO law was if you were a member of an enterprise and a leader of an enterprise, you could be convicted and sentenced to 30 to 50 years.
By using the RICO Act, the government no longer need to prove these top mobsters are guilty of a specific crime. Just proving they are in charge of the mafia will be enough to send them down as part of a mass criminal conspiracy. Giuliani and his team use years of FBI surveillance and witness testimony as evidence against the bosses. And eventually their strategy pays off. On November 19th, 1986, a jury finds the bosses guilty of mass criminal conspiracy.
This is a great day for law enforcement, but this is a bad day, probably the worst, for the mafia.
In a stunning victory for the government, the bosses are each sentenced to 100 years behind bars.
They proved the effectiveness of the RICO law.
This was a big prosecution where everybody was going to do a big amount of jail time, and the government scored a clean sweep.
With one bold move, the authorities have taken out the entire leadership of the New York Mafia. Or so they think. Leading the celebrations of the squads of the FBI's Special Mafia Task Force. These 5 squads have been on the front line in the war against organized crime. One of its key agents is John Pritchard.
Each squad would go after a particular family. The family that I was assigned to supervise the investigation of was, in fact, the Genovese crime family.
The Genovese squad's target had been the star defendant in the commission trial, Fat Tony Salerno. Despite the apparent success of the FBI's Genovese squad, Pritchard isn't in the mood to celebrate. Something about the commission trial is troubling him. He has long harbored doubts about Salerno's ability to head up the Genovese family.
Fat Tony Salerno was viewed and believed to be the head of the Genovese crime family. But you have to understand, at that point, it was just theory.
To Pritchard, the comical-looking Salerno never seemed to display any of the attributes of a top mafia boss. And he's starting to suspect that the Genovese squad may have just sent down the wrong man. It's a remarkable suspicion. If Pritchard is right, that means the real Genovese boss is still at large. As law enforcement continues to celebrate their victory over the mafia, intelligence comes in which adds to Pritchard's suspicion that Fat Tony Salerno is the wrong guy. Across town, Vincent Cafaro, Tony Salerno's supposed right-hand man, is facing a racketeering charge. In an attempt to strike a deal with his interrogators, Cafaro decides to reveal some remarkable information. He dramatically confesses to investigators that Fat Tony Salerno was never the boss of the Genovese family. According to Cafaro, Salerno was never anything more than a stooge.
That was a ruse to throw us off the track of ultimately who was in fact the leader of the family.
So just who is the real boss? The person Cafaro now names takes the investigators completely by surprise. It's someone they would never have suspected.
He told them that the real leader of the family, and had been the leader for years, was Vincent Gigante.
But for years, the FBI had viewed Vincent Gigante as a bumbling madman.
He wandered around the city in his pajamas sometimes, acting strangely and bizarrely.
He would do things like speak with the parking meters, urinate in public.
How could anyone think that this person would be the head of the most powerful mobster family in America?
Agent Pritchard wonders whether Gigante could actually have hoaxed the entire Bureau. If true, the squad's biggest success against the Genovese family in convicting Tony Salerno could now be their greatest humiliation. If true, Gigante is now the most powerful mob boss in America. Could this shuffling madman really have played them all for fools? For Agent John Pritchard, one thing is clear. If he's going to set the record straight, he has a massive task before him. He's going to have to convince the entire city that this madman is in fact a ruthless mob boss. For the US government, the Mafia Commission trial has been a resounding success. The 5 heads of New York's Mafia have been given lifelong sentences for racketeering. But when an informant reveals in a shocking twist that their biggest catch, Genovese boss Fat Tony Salerno, is just a front, they start to wonder if the mastermind behind the Genovese family might still be at large. Could the boss really be Vincent Gigante, a shuffling lunatic believed to suffer from mental illness? While many in the FBI find the idea ridiculous, Agent John Pritchard is far less surprised.
I believe that Gigante was far more powerful than necessarily than he had been given credit for.
Now, an insider claims that this bumbling madman could have pulled off one of the greatest scams in criminal history. To expose it, Agent Pritchard realizes he and his team will have to start by re-examining every piece of intelligence the Bureau holds on Gigante.
That historical information, you know, that was used as to bring people up to speed in terms of who this guy really was.
Pritchard discovers that Gigante first came to the attention of the FBI in 1957. Only in his 20s, he was given the contract to kill rival crime boss Frank Costello, head of the Lucchese family. But Gigante's assassination attempt failed.
You would think that that kind of high-profile failure would doom your career. But in Gigante's case, it really didn't seem to have that effect.
Gigante quickly rose through the ranks of the new Genovese family, and by the early 60s had reached the rank of capo. This was a senior position within the family, putting him in command of his own crew. In the mid-60s, just as Gigante became a contender for a senior position in the family, he mysteriously falls off the radar.
They had really no file on Gigante from like 66, which is kind of crazy when you consider that even at that point, he was a well-known guy.
For some reason, the FBI's attention shifted to Fat Tony Salerno. Something dramatic had happened, but what? When Pritchard examines the FBI's earlier investigation into the Genovese mob, he discovers a report that could explain everything. Back in 1981, the FBI decided to use Gigante as the unwitting bait for a tactic called tickling the wires. Tickling means provoking the mob and then listening out for chatter that might incriminate them. And one of the mobsters the squad targeted was Vincent Gigante. They decide to issue him a subpoena to see how other members of the Genovese family react. But when the agents turn up at Gigante's home, the investigation stops in its tracks.
The agents get inside, they go through the apartment, and they go to the bathroom where they hear the shower running, and they open the door, and there's Vincent Gigante.
Nude under the shower holding an umbrella. I mean, you know, that that story went around the New York office quite a bit. You know, it was very humorous.
It's suddenly clear to Agent Pritchard why Gigante dropped off the Bureau's radar.
For the most part, the concept or the theory the FBI had that he was a little bit of a daffy guy, but he was really not that important.
After the shower incident, the FBI stops pursuing Gigante. Could the head of the Genovese family have been faking? Agent Pritchard worries that Gigante may have been misdirecting the FBI for years. Pritchard turns his attention to FBI surveillance reports and the unofficial Genovese HQ, the Triangle Social Club in Lower Manhattan.
The Genovese family would congregate there pretty much every day and play cards and appear to be socializing.
One of the first things they were trying to do is identify the people in the Genovese family and who was who.
Over the years, the squad employed a variety of methods to put pressure on the Genovese mobsters to break cover. Agents openly patrolled outside the Triangle Club, writing down the license plates of every car. And in full view of the mobsters, put the bar under constant surveillance.
And they would just have someone there with a camera taking pictures of who came in and out. And by doing that, they could figure out who the hierarchy was.
And throughout the FBI's surveillance, Agent Pritchard discovers that Vincent Gigante stuck to the same routine.
If you're doing FBI surveillance, you're going to see every day on Sullivan Street, Vincent Gigante going from his apartment to the social club. Once he gets there, you're going to see a procession of the family's top capos coming in and going out, back and forth.
And although the so-called lunatic was frequently observed wandering the streets around the club with high-ranking mobsters, despite their best efforts, the FBI failed to record any conversations.
The Genovese guys, they're a very close-knit and closed-mouthed group. And they didn't have a lot of success.
The squad surveillance teams concluded that Gigante was harmless, a relic from a previous era tolerated by the real bosses. Everything Pritchard reads suggests the FBI ignored Gigante, believing he was little more than an ex-mobster with dementia. For all intents and purposes, he appears to be mentally ill, incapable of crossing the road, let alone running $1 million criminal empire. But Pritchard can't let go of his hunch. What if Gigante is the proverbial wolf in sheep's clothing? The very fact that he continued to move in mob circles was surely suspicious.
There's no question about it. I mean, if you're in the mafia and you're crazy, really crazy, you're not going to last in the mafia, not at all.
Agent Pritchard decides to go back to square one. It's time to start surveillance of his own. For decades, Gigante has been thought of as a bit player, but now Pritchard decides to give him the attention he deserves.
They were very intent on doing what had not been done in a long time, which was to get Vincent Gigante indicted in a courtroom.
This time, the squad keeps their presence discreet, secretly setting up round-the-clock surveillance of the Triangle Club. It isn't long before Agent Pritchard sees evidence that his hunch about Gigante is right.
I was participating in a surveillance one night, and saw him with the usual ratty bathrobe that he wore. And all of a sudden, he had taken off the bathrobe, and he had a very well-tailored sharkskin suit on.
It just further cemented for him that they were after the right guy.
Because it just showed me, or convinced me, that whole thing was an act.
It's the moment Pritchard has been waiting for. Now he presses the button on a new investigation into Gigante. In 1987, after the most high-profile operation in the history of organized crime, the heads of New York's 5 mafia families are now behind bars. But FBI agent John Pritchard is convinced that one of them, Fat Tony Salerno, is just a fall guy. He has mounting evidence that the real boss of the Genovese family is Vincent Gigante, a long-forgotten Genovese capo believed to be suffering from mental health issues. And after close surveillance, Pritchard discovers hints that Gigante's illness is just a clever act perfected over many years.
He had this great fear of going to jail, of being prosecuted.
But Pritchard needs more than a hunch. He has to prove Gigante's mental illness is a deception. He returns to the case files. He eventually comes across a report from 1970. It reveals the very moment that Gigante came up with the idea for his perfect cover.
He was accused of bribing, it sounds crazy, but bribing the entire police force of a New Jersey town that he lived in. Which, you know, he didn't consider to be anything more than kind of a gesture of goodwill.
But local prosecutors decide to make a case against him. And trapped in a corner, Gigante tries something extraordinary. He checks himself into a hospital and convinces psychiatrists he is schizophrenic.
His lawyer came to court and said, my client is mentally unwell and he's actually in a mental hospital. This is 1969, 1970. The idea of an insanity defense really hadn't been broached anywhere.
He was cunning, and he saw a dodge that he took, or attempted to take, to get out from under the thumb.
Gigante's strategy works. At trial, he's acquitted of all charges. And over the next decade, Gigante meticulously embellishes his role, building a convincing picture of a mentally disturbed man. A tactic that was paying dividends.
There's a developing sense that hey, this is not a bad way to approach these things. And he decided to go big with it.
Every couple of months, he would go in for what was known as a tune-up. He would actually check into a mental clinic.
It became almost like a vacation. Like if I would go to Disney World, he would go to the St. Vincent's Mental Hospital.
The orchestrated visits give Gigante virtual immunity from prosecution. So he takes the idea further. Taking the charade out onto the streets, it takes him out of the FBI's firing line. Gigante plays the harmless old man among a family of killers. And for decades, the shuffling old man act appears to dupe the FBI. But now, Agent John Pritchard has to find a way to expose Gigante as the fraud he suspects he is. First, he has to blow the crazy act wide open, and then prove he's the real boss of the murderous Genovese family. Pritchard pours more resources into his investigation. He increases surveillance on Gigante and targets his known associates. It only needs one conversation to reveal him as the real boss, and he immediately becomes responsible for every crime carried out by his organization.
We were going after people that we felt could draw Gigante into a conspiracy involving a RICO case. And in fact, that was the emphasis. We knew that eventually, if we kept after him, that we would be able to show that he, in fact, was the leadership of the family.
The squad now has growing evidence that behind his act, Gigante is sane. But lacking anything concrete, the team are in danger of losing momentum. But if he ever needed convincing, Pritchard discovers just how important his investigation was. In January 1986, two of his detectives, Anthony Vendetti and Kathy Burke, are on a routine surveillance operation. They're watching one of Gigante's mobsters.
A fellow by the name of Fritzy Gianovelli. Fritzy was a capo that answered to Gigante. It was a routine surveillance, and it wasn't one that, you would think was be particularly dangerous.
When their shift ends, the detectives head home. But they've been spotted by their mark. And unknown to them, they're now being followed. The detectives decide to stop for a coffee. Vendetti heads into the diner, while Burke waits for him in the car. Giovanelli and his crew decide to strike. Burke spots the danger and tries to stop them. But she's not quick enough. The mobsters shoot her. Then Vendetti. Burke is seriously wounded. And tragically, Tony Vendetti lies dead.
It was emotional for me because I had lost a friend, a detective that worked for me on the squad.
Agent Pritchard's investigation just got personal, and he decides it's time to enter the lion's den. After a murderous attack on his detectives, Agent John Pritchard decides to confront the Genovese boss face to face.
Knowing that Gigante was the head of the family, he took on far more importance because of their shooting. Myself and another agent went to interview him at the Triangle Club.
Gigante is ordered to step outside. And according to Pritchard, when confronted about the shooting, completely drops his act.
He saw that we were serious, and he was very lucid. There was no doubt in my mind, having this conversation with him, that he was as sane as I am.
Back at the squad's HQ, Pritchard gathers his team. The shooting means bringing Gigante to justice is more urgent than ever. It's now clear their target isn't just sane, he's dangerous. So far, though, the squad has failed to get any tangible evidence against Gigante. And now he's been inside the Triangle Club, Pritchard knows why.
I'm probably one of the few agents that have been inside the Triangle Social Club. There was a sign up on the wall over the payphone that this location is bugged. Don't say anything in here that's criminal. They actually had that written on the wall.
It's clear that wherever Gigante is doing his business, it isn't at the Triangle Club. The boss must have another secret HQ. The squad decide to escalate their surveillance. And eventually, they get a break.
As the FBI increased its surveillance of the Chin, they came to realize that Sullivan Street was not the be-all and end-all of kind of his existence as they initially thought.
Every evening at the same time, Gigante is picked up by a driver from his mother's apartment building on Sullivan Street. And he doesn't reappear until the next morning. So where does he go? Pritchard's team focus their efforts on following Gigante's car. Tailing him is easier said than done, because wherever he's going, he doesn't want to be followed. For weeks, Gigante's drivers expertly navigate the city's streets, shaking off any FBI tails. The squad don't give up. And eventually, they discover where Gigante has been hiding.
They finally traced him to a home on the east side.
We realized that it was being used as a place for him to hang his hat, if you will.
The apartment belongs to Gigante's mistress, Olympia Esposito. It's a well-chosen location, making a clear line of sight for Pritchard's surveillance teams difficult. But they find a safe position on the roof of a local school.
One of the agents on the squad really did a Herculean job in terms of, at night, all sorts of weather, crawling out on this ledge to observe what was going on within Gigante's residence.
Over the next 4 months, the agent painstakingly records Gigante's behavior inside the apartment. And at last, they have visual evidence that Gigante isn't mad.
They could see how well dressed he was, how he acted normally, how people came, he had conferences.
He actually had people there for meetings. We saw him in conversation at the table. We observed him, counting money and things like that.
What the FBI saw confirmed everything that they had believed. That this was a mob boss. He was not a mental patient.
To prove Gigante is the Genovese boss in a courtroom, they need him on tape. So far, the mobster has no idea the squad are onto him. Pritchard now knows just how paranoid Gigante is. Any mistake they make could blow the entire investigation, and months of work will go down the drain. To reduce the risk of discovery, Pritchard decides to use some expert help.
It was a really rare opportunity for the FBI to have recordings of this guy. And they brought in a FBI specialist who had this special drill, and it was supposed to go just so far into the wall, and then it would sense where the other side was and stop.
Unfortunately, the installation of the device didn't go particularly well, and in fact, it was discovered. We tried things that were unique, and sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't.
The botched attempt to install the bug tips off Gigante. He immediately resorts to his tried and tested fallback plan and books himself into a mental institution. With Gigante's deception successfully resurrected, the Oddfather believes he is safe. But Pritchard's investigation will yet come back to haunt the great illusionist. Agent John Pritchard has now come closer than anyone to getting Vincent Gigante in court. the man he now believes is the true mafia boss and has been duping law enforcement for decades. But his squads fail to secure any taped evidence. It's critical to bringing to justice the man known as the Oddfather. With the investigation stalled, Gigante remains free. It's a personal blow for Pritchard. His only hope now is that someone else picks up the chase.
A lot of stuff that was developed over the years just doesn't die. It sits there as evidence. So eventually, some prosecutor or some agent down the road is going to be able to use that earlier evidence.
2 years later, lawyer Greg O'Connell picks up where Pritchard left off. His challenge is to prove on the record that Gigante is sane and in charge. But O'Connell has found a way to succeed where Pritchard's squad had failed. He's managed to get a Genovese associate to cooperate with his investigation and testify that Vincent Gigante is the Genovese boss. His informer's name is Peter Savino.
I would look at that as the milestone event. Peter Savino were directly on record with Vincent Gigante. He had met with Gigante on dozens and dozens of occasions. So Savino was absolutely critical to our investigation. We had him wired up against numerous organized crime figures in New York for a year and a half.
The RICO Act means O'Connell doesn't need direct evidence to put Gigante away. He only needs to link him to a conspiracy. And thanks to Savino, he thinks he's found a way. Throughout the 1980s, the 5 mafia families formed a cartel to muscle in on one of New York's biggest maintenance contracts. Replacing windows in the city's housing projects generates over $170 million for the mafia. And the man chosen by Gigante to represent the Genovese family's interests is Peter Savino.
Peter Savino was a major earner for the crime family. He was a guy that knew how to make money. But because Savino was the Genovese crime family representative in the window replacement business, that gave us a focus for our extortion charges.
Savino agrees to testify that Gigante is a key member of the Windows cartel, proving beyond doubt that Gigante is capable of running a complicated criminal scam. O'Connell feels this case is solid enough to put Gigante in front of a jury. On May the 30th, 1990, the authorities make their move. Gigante is arrested. As he's led into court, prosecutors know he will play the insanity card for everything it's worth. But stalling the trial is something O'Connell and his team can't afford.
The real key to it was Peter Savino. And Savino, by this time, was dying of cancer.
If Savino dies before he has a chance to testify, the case against Gigante crumbles.
Gigante kept up his usual ruse, muttering to himself, sometimes looking with his head down as a hangdog, looking around, paying no attention to what was going on.
Gigante tries to convince the court that he's schizophrenic and unfit to stand trial. It works. The case is on the verge of collapse, but this time they're prepared. They've got a second witness to testify to Gigante's sanity. And now they play their trump card. A secret star witness, Sammy the Bull Gravano. As former underboss of the Gambino family, Gravano had meetings with Gigante. And in March 1996, he testifies that on those occasions, the Genovese crime boss had been perfectly lucid.
He was able to describe in a very meaningful and impactful way the role that Gigante played in his own organized crime life.
Gigante is declared competent to stand trial by the judge, and O'Connell and his team have the green light to present their case. It includes more than 250 exhibits, including much of the evidence from Pritchard's investigation.
Having an FBI agent sit on the witness stand and testify in great detail about the normal nature of his second life was really crippling to the defense.
It's now time for Peter Savino to put the nail in the coffin for the prosecution. Terminally ill with cancer, Savino is unable to attend the trial in person, so he testifies via CCTV from his secret location on the Witness Protection Program. It's a devastating blow for Gigante's lawyers.
If a defense attorney could pick the most difficult person to challenge in terms of credibility, it would be somebody dying of cancer from testifying from his deathbed.
Despite his pain, Savino makes it through the cross-examination. And on July 25th, 1997, Gigante is found guilty on 8 counts of racketeering and conspiracy, and being godfather of the Genovese family.
Gigante would have died in his own bed if it hadn't been for Peter Savino. His evidence was devastating.
Sentenced to 15 years behind bars, Gigante's health starts to decline, this time for real. And with the writing on the wall, he finally drops his guard.
He decided to lighten up. And he was chit-chatting with the nurses, acting normally, and looking to enjoy his remaining days. And when news of this came out, that he had shed his act, the Eastern District U.S. Attorney's Office decided to indict him again on obstruction of justice.
On December the 19th, 2005, Vincent Gigante dies, age 77. For over 2 decades, his cat-and-mouse game with the authorities kept him one step ahead of justice, allowing him to retain absolute power over the New York Mafia and govern his criminal empire with impunity.
Inside the Mafia, the most respected, feared, cunning, and tyrannical leader was Vincent Chin Gigante. No question about it.
Gigante's elaborate charade failed to last, and thanks to the stubborn pursuit of investigators like John Pritchard, the odd father of organized crime is finally taken down.
There are 2 decades of efforts by some of the best FBI agents that we had that ultimately succeeded in taking him down off his throne.
He engendered so much fear in people because if you made a mistake, that would be enough for him to eliminate you. I feel personally good that we were able to take Gigante and take him down